In section 2.4, we're talking about method parameters and return values. And another way to think of those two terms is parameters are inputs and return values are outputs. So we're in and out for methods. Here's an example of how we've used parameters or inputs already. System.out is an object, and it has a method called println. And so when you use the println method, it doesn't work unless you give it some text to print. Okay, so that's the input for the method. Another way to think of that would be ingredients. And so if you've got a recipe to create a cake, you have to give it some inputs in order for that recipe to actually do anything. So you have to give it some eggs and milk and that sort of stuff. So for println to do anything, it needs an input, and here is the text that we're using for our parameter. Okay. Now, not all methods have parameters, and so you've seen this method used before, and it has empty parentheses, and that's because to do its job, it doesn't need any inputs from us. It has all the information it needs inside the object that's calling it, so here's how that works. So return values are outputs, and they're the method doing its job and then spitting out a result. So in this case, we have a string called mySentence, and it has this text in it. And then we have an int called number, and it is set to be equal to mySentence.length. Okay, so how's that going to work? MySentence is an object, it's a string object, and all string objects have a length method that can tell you how many characters are in that object. We covered that last time. Now, the length method has a return value. It has an output, and that output is an integer value representing the number of characters here. So again, it doesn't need any inputs because it has all the information it needs to do the job inside of the variable here. So mySentence.length, that method will count up these numbers, count up the characters, including spaces, and it will return the answer out of the front end here. So it's almost like it shoots it through the equal sign, and it ends up inside of number. And then if we do system.out.println number, we'll see the result of that, okay? So once again, parameters are inputs. So this method called println has a bunch of text that is an input. It doesn't work unless you give it that text. Return values are outputs. And so the way that you know you're using one of those is if you have something being set by it, something being assigned. So mySentence.length, that value is assigned to number. The number's handed over to number. And this one, doesn't need any parameters. So let's run that and see what it looks like. And the first one we did was just printing this out. And the println method requires some text in order to work, hence this text. And then in this case, we have gotten a return value from the length method and stored that in number, and then we printed that out at the console. So 25 is the number of characters here. Okay. Okay, we're going to take a look at another example of some parameters, because in this case, there's only one parameter. It's just a string of text. But sometimes there's more than one. Sometimes you have lots of parameters you have to put in one after another inside of these parentheses. So here's an example of a method from the string class that requires two parameters. So I'm going to set up some strings to demonstrate this example. Okay, that's this person's full name. And we'll call this one new middle name. Okay, and so let's say in this example that we want the full name to replace its middle name. So instead of John Matthew Smith, it should say John James Smith. So the string class has a method called replace that takes two parameters and it returns a value. And so let me set this up and show you how it works. So I'm going to say any string object can call this method, and we want to use full name. So full name dot replace. So the first parameter is the string that I want to change. So I want to get rid of the middle part of that name, the word Matthew. So I'm going to put that in quotes. And so that's what it's going to look to replace. Then I add a comma. And I put in the second parameter. And the second parameter is the string that I want to replace it with. And I could put in some text here. Or since I already have that as a variable, I can just put new middle name. Okay. Now, if I tried to print this out, you wouldn't see any change. If you remember from the toUpper example, it doesn't actually change this. It just gives you the uppercase version in a new string. And so I could create a new string and call this result. You know what? I'll just leave it like that. And then here on the front, I'll say result equals. Okay? And then if I print out result, you should see the new middle name replaced in there. So let's run that. And there we have John James Smith. Now, if I wanted to make a change to full name so that this original variable changes its own name and I can print it both ways, then I wouldn't want to use a separate string. I could just say full name equals full name replace Matthew, new middle name, okay? And so we can put in full name there, and we get the same output there. So to demonstrate that that's working, we will print out full name before the example, before the change, then we'll make the change, and then we will print it again. So you have John Matthew Smith and John James Smith. So here you have the combination of both things happening. The replace method takes two parameters. Both of them are strings. You can either use literal text like that, or you can just give it the name of your variable if it's a string variable. And then it also returns a value. It returns a new string that has the change. So what you can do is take the variable you want to switch and just set it equal to itself with the new replace command. So full name equals full name.replace Matthew, new middle name. Okay. So that's how return values and parameters work. Remember to think of parameters as inputs, and sometimes there's more than one. Sometimes there's 2, 3, 4 different individual items you have to give to the method in order for it to work. And return values are outputs. So just think of it as calling the method, and just remember visually that something comes flying out of the front end of that method when it's all done. And so whatever comes out of there, in this case it would be a number, an integer, it goes through the equal sign and ends up in whatever you try to catch it with. Okay? Just like here, the string that's completed comes flying out here, goes through the equal sign, and we catch it with full name again. So that overwrites the old version and puts the new one in there. One other thing you need to know about parameters is that there's two kinds. There's explicit and implicit parameters. And so I'm just going to clear all this off. And we'll go back to our original example, system.out.println. Okay, the explicit parameter is the stuff you add to the parentheses. Okay, explicit means you're doing it in an observable way. It's out there. It's intentional. It's on purpose. The implicit parameter is the object that's involved here, because println has access to use all the object's attributes, and so sometimes there's variables inside of there that can be used. Okay, so just a memorization thing, but implicit, the implied parameters are that we're using the object that called the method. The explicit parameters, the ones that we can see out here that are obvious, are the ones that we specifically hand over in the parentheses. So explicit parameters, and then the object is the implicit parameter. In another example, string my name equals Fred. And if we say int n equals my name dot length, there are no explicit parameters in the length method, but there is an implicit parameter, and that's the object. Okay, so my name is the object, and that is a string, and it has the characters that are being counted. So the length method is using the data inside of my name to calculate that. We didn't have to give it any extra information to do that. It has all it needs inside of my name. That's why the object, my name, is the implicit or implied parameter, even though there's no explicit or obvious external parameters. Okay, and that comes up in one of the self-check questions. One other thing you should know from this section, all methods have a definition that you can look up, and we're going to talk about where you look these up in the next couple of sections here, but for right now I just want you to look at what a method definition looks like. And so these are two definitions. I have them in quotes because you wouldn't normally write them in the text, in the main function right here. So it'll give you just errors if you write it like that. So I just have it in comments. But the word public we'll get into later. But this is what the length method looks like in the definition. It returns an integer, and its name is length, and there's no explicit parameters in the parenthesis. The replace method, on the other hand, is also public, which again we'll talk about later. It returns a string, its name is replace, and it takes two explicit parameters in the parentheses. The first is a string, and they call it target. That's not a real name, it's just kind of a label to tell you what sort of data would go in there. And the second is a string called replacement. All right, and you saw how that works. So that's just how they look when you look them up in the reference guide. The return type is listed, the name of the method, and any parameters that are in there, and what their types are. So return type, name of the method, and parameter names and types. Okay, that's going to come up in one of the questions for the self-check. Okay, that's section 2.4. You should be able to answer the self-check questions on page 42.